other voices, other views, which is kind of whatever you're having yourself, I guess. And we'll find out soon from a distinguished panel what their thoughts and their other views and other voices are. You have the extended biographies of colleagues who are speaking on the program itself, so I won't say much by way of introduction. People are going to speak for 5 minutes, and we should be strict about that, so we'll have plenty of time for conversation and discussion afterwards. We're going to begin with Patrick Cook, who's the director of the MA in Cultural Policy and Arts Management at UCD for many years. And as the author, I saw you had it, I think, with you, an extraordinary book of well over 400 pages. There, I mean, quite remarkable book, and which came out last year, and an important one for people to engage with. We're going to be turning to Maureen Keneally, and Maureen is, of course, Director of the Arts Council of Ireland. Can I allow to say that you're an NUI Galway graduate? Can I make a parochial comment while I'm at it? I hope that's all right. And to Robert Reid, who is CEO of the National Concert Hall here in Dublin, and then Scarf is Director of the National Museum of Ireland. So we have a very distinguished panel, and they have so many accomplishments and so many other activities that they're engaged in currently and in the past that I think we'll be able to draw on as well. So without further ado, we're going to start with Pat, and look forward to your comments.
Do I still?
Yeah, very much.
Well, okay, I can sit here. Yeah. I was kind of glad eventually that Stephen mentioned the issue of class and inequality in the end of the day there this afternoon. Because if I were to say there was a specific deficit in the discourse around cultural value at the moment, it is around the fundamental questions of actually economic inequality and the questions of social justice that arise from these very material conditions of people's lives. And they matter to this sector. And I went back through the 2016 report that Jeff was one of the co-authors on during the week, and I did a kind of little discourse analysis on looking for words like class, equality and inequality. And the kind of thing I was finding was that generally the references to equality and inequality were intracultural. In other words, they were around questions of diversity and around identity. So it was largely gender and ethnicity-based concerns about equaling up. And disability came into the equation quite a lot. But there are very few references to class in it. And indeed, there's only one use of the word capitalism in the entire document, and that is a reference which itself references Raymond Williams. And to go back to Williams, I think he never lost sight of this question of the social justice thing. And he had this great quote in his book, Culture and Society, which I still think is a foundational text for anybody interested in cultural value. And he actually, in that, he quoted William Morris in the 19th century. And this is the quote: "Surely anyone who professes to think that the question of art and cultivation must go before that of the knife and the fork, but does not understand what art means, or how that its roots must have a soil of a thriving and unanxious life." And every time I read that, I'm always reminded of that great management paradigm. Do you know Maslow's hierarchy of value? With the base needs at the bottom of the broad base, and then self-actualization at the top. Well, I always think that bears a pretty good analogy to the way it works dynamically in terms of the class structure of society. Self-actualization is a kind of an elite activity and achievement at the top of that pyramid. And somewhere over the last 30, 40 years in the processes of the neoliberal age, shall we say, we lost sight, I think, of these fundamental questions of social justice as intrinsic to cultural value in some way. And one of my great sources of inspiration on this is the American literary professor, as it happens, Walter Ben Michaels, who wrote a book called The Trouble with Diversity. Extremely challenging book. And he challenges the dominance of cultural diversity as a valuation system within society, the damage it's doing. Just a few quotes from him. "The big selling point of cultural diversity is that cultures are essentially equal. That's what makes them different from classes. Since classes are essentially unequal, they involve more or less money." He claims that we would much rather celebrate cultural diversity than to seek to establish economic equality. To the extent that the phantasm of respect for difference displaces the commitment to economic justice. Now, only last week I was listening to the analysis programme on BBC4, and there was a great discussion there involving the distinguished Nobel Prize-winning economist Angus Deaton. And one of the remarkable pieces of data he put out there was that that out of the total of all wealth resources in the US in 1990, half was owned by those with college degrees, and the other half by those without a college degree. Whereas today, the proportions are 3/4 of all wealth is owned by those with college degrees, and the other quarter of wealth is owned by the 2/3 of the population who do not have a college degree. Now, we need to take these on board for the reflexivity of this sector we live in. I think, again, Stephen alluded to it in his. I would say everybody here in this room has a third-level degree. And I would say the vast majority of artists and practicing artists have third-level degrees. So they're part of a socially privileged group. Bourdieu has a fantastic phrase to describe the social position of the artist. He calls them the dominated fragment of the dominant class, which is brilliant. And the way he would describe that is kind of anecdotally, it would be the younger brother or sister of a generally well-to-do family who can afford to be a bohemian. So they suffer this double alienation from their old class, and they wish to fraternise with the class from which they are also alienated, namely the working classes. And this, I'm afraid to say, and it comes across in my book, I hope, is this has been reproduced in our arts policies over the last 30 to 40 years. The big cleavage in Irish arts policy, since the foundation of the Arts Council, was that before 1973, the Arts Council would only fund amateur arts and would not, and had an order saying, we will not support the professional artist. This was brought in under, ironically, the only artist who ran the council, namely Sean O'Freillan, himself a writer and a strong libertarian who believed that the artist had to remain independent of public funding. By 1973, we get a shift. For the first time ever, as a result of the Arts Act, artists are put onto the council. So therefore you have the interests of artists being directly represented to the council itself. And to the question this morning, who wants to know? It's not only government wants to know, artists want to know. Artists have an interest to protect. So when you get to the 1990s and you get a very dynamic intellectual in charge of the council, namely Kieran Benson, former professor of psychology in UCD, he tried to push forward a much broader communitarian agenda for the arts at that time. But the artists were having none of it. Because as far as they were concerned, every penny that went to community was money out of their pockets and money out of their mouths. So, and I mean, there is a class insensitivity there. So we got around to a point where the Arts Council would only subsidise community arts to the extent that the professional artist was involved in doing projects there. It wasn't really about empowering from the bottom up, as the original Arts Council had under the ethic of amateurism. So I would say we need to talk about class, we need to talk about inequalities of wealth, and we need to talk reflexively about ourselves and where we stand as privileged, educated individuals in the overall scheme of how culture is spoken about and deployed. I mentioned in my comment earlier on that the Arts Council survey of 2004, I think it was, clearly said the public answered back on a value basis, we want education and local community arts as our top value. Right down at the bottom of the list is the professional artist. This is a challenge, a fundamental challenge for arts policy and probably for cultural policy more widely. I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you very much, Pat. And I should probably acknowledge that Tanya Banoffee was due to be on the panel and is unfortunately suffering from COVID, but I presume she would have interesting thoughts to share on that. So we'll turn on to Maureen Pinelli from a nice point of transition between historical questions related to the Arts Council to the current director. So Maureen.
Thanks, Ben. Good afternoon, everybody. Hope you can hear me okay. And so much in what you said there, Pat, that I'd love to pick up hopefully in the discussion or indeed afterwards. And I guess very fitting that we're having this discussion in the 70th year of the Arts Council. Hopefully that has come to your attention, that we are looking back at the 70 years, but also using that to say what should the next decades look like. So it's particularly apt to think that we're having this discussion today. So thank you very much to Eve and to everybody involved in putting this together this afternoon. I was going to reflect just for a few minutes on what we define from our experience and our perspective as being cultural values. So as I say, it's a good time because it's the 70th anniversary, but it's also a brilliant time because we're bringing forward a number of new policies, and a number of new policies have come forward, particularly our equality, human rights and diversity, which I'm very pleased that Pat raised the socio-economic disadvantage theme there. That's very much the guiding principle for us. So every day of our working lives and the multiple conversations that we have with a whole range of publics, we use the concept of cultural value to press home the very reason for our existence. That's why we have an Arts Council after all. It informs all our work. It informs how we assess applications, how we formulate policy in collaboration with artists and with those who work in the arts, how we make the case to government, and how we communicate about the arts to people. And I wanted to first of all look at the concept of change and how that's inextricably linked with our definition of cultural value. So many people in this room, I'm sure most people will be very familiar with the work of Francois Matarazzo, and we engaged Francois many years back before I was ever with the Arts Council to help us with the definition of what does good quality artistic activity look like. And Francois brought forward a document in which it's defined that artistic quality is technically excellent work which is both ambitious and original. It connects to people and their concerns, and it leaves audiences changed in some lasting way. And it's that theme of change that I think is particularly important. That is what we're inviting artists and arts organisations to do, to say, how does your work change the public in some lasting way? And I'm reminded here of the Pulitzer Prize poet Paul Muldoon's invocation that a poem should be a disturbing unit, and that the act of going through a good poem, reading it, experiencing it, should leave a reader changed in some way that hopefully is lasting and hopefully for that person's benefit. And at the Arts Council, and I like the fact that you introduced Borgia, I like to think of creating a civic force field of the arts as charging units, almost like electricity power stations in multiple locations that will deliver real and lasting cultural value. A colleague of mine, Susan Collin, will be known to many people in the room, known to Pat, I'm sure, who used to work at the Arts Council. She brought to my attention the report which was brought forward in early 2020 in the UK from the Arts and Humanities Research Council on understanding the value of arts and culture. I'm sure many people here are familiar with it. And that looked at 70 original pieces of work. And an important conclusion from that research is that one of the most significant ways that arts and culture activity and engagement brings value to both individuals and society is by creating the conditions for change. And the report talks about an openness, a space for experimentation and risk-taking at the personal, social and economic level, an ability to reflect in a safer and less direct way on personal, community and societal challenges, and much else. And these changes may involve significant personal transformations such as improved self-understanding and a breaking of routine ways of thinking, and may also affect how we relate to others through increased empathy. And I'm sure your empathy has come up already. And I guess we'd all agree that the pandemic is changing the contours of the very way we live our lives, of how we think about each other, of how we have increased empathy, how we can think inside each other's skins to a far greater degree. So as I mentioned at the top, the cultural value particularly informs our approach to corporate policies in recent years. So in the summer of 2019, we brought forward our equality, human rights and diversity policy. In February 2020, we brought forward the paying the artist policy, and shortly, in a few weeks' time, we'll be publishing our spatial policy. And what we're looking at here, particularly in terms of spatial, is the impact of the work we support. How do we ask people about the work we support? How do we measure it? And how do we communicate it? And last year we introduced a social impact assessment guide. It's available on our site, and it's a way of helping us to help organisations measure their work, and it helps us ensure that we're applying the resources in the most equitable and efficient way possible, and make sure that the resources that we apply have a lasting societal impact, and that inclusion and diversity are at the very heart of each choice and each decision that's made by us, and crucially made by our partners. And as mentioned, that we'll be launching our spatial policy in a few weeks' time, and that guide forms a very central part of it. The central tenet of the spatial policy is our belief that everyone has the opportunity to create, engage with, participate in and enjoy the arts and culture, regardless of who they are or where they live and work. And we see creative expression as a fundamental part of our humanity. We want Ireland to be a country where people can confidently exercise their rights to creative and cultural expression and engagement, because we believe this ultimately leads to a richer, more multifaceted quality of life. And we're thinking of this spatial policy very much in terms of people and place. We know that places are dynamic and responsive to continuous change, and they are inextricably linked with both individual and collective identity. And who's part of this discussion around cultural value? Pat pointed out, most of us here probably have a degree of some sort of other. So we need to entirely rethink this. We know we've had not anything like all the voices in the room, and until we have that full panoply of perspectives and experiences fully in part of the discussion arena, our definition of cultural value is always incomplete. So many voices we know have been ignored, overlooked, sidelined, and simply unheard over the years. And it's a key driving imperative of ours that the new artistic landscape post-COVID will have space for all these voices, and will be vastly more welcoming, and will be truly inclusive. And I guess hopefully people know that we're in the current scenario, we have a historic level of funding. So it has jumped from a base of 75 million in 2019 to a current level of 130 million. I hope that if I was here speaking with you at the 75 million, I would still be as determined about this need to push through our inclusion and diversity agenda. So just a few very quick references to research. There are many international studies that have shown that involvement in the arts is a vital way to build empathy, and that contributes significantly to social cohesion and solidarity. We engage in surveys with behaviour and attitudes every year, and the most recent one showed that 61% of people feel strongly that the arts are essential to their mental well-being. We also engage in sustained surveys with the Economic and Social Research Institute, and they show that children's participation in arts and cultural activities are associated with improved cognitive development and social skills. So it's heartening that the current programme for government says that the arts are essential to the well-being of our society, and in bringing communities together, we want to make the arts even more accessible and inclusive to everyone. So coming to a conclusion, I want to turn back to Matarazzo for a second. And in an introductory piece he wrote for Kilkenny Collective for Arts Talent, a great organisation in Kilkenny, he writes that a work of art asks us to be open to another person. That's the extraordinary offer it makes. And there's nothing more difficult, more exhilarating, or more important. When we make art, we're trying to communicate what gives meaning to our experience of being alive. And it's in that experience of us as audience, in experience then that piece of art, we're communicating back to the creator, but crucially we're communicating to each other as well, in the hope of being understood and recognised. And I imagine that that's what we all agree the arts did to glorious effect during COVID. The arts enabled individuals and communities to express solidarity and maintain a sense of collective well-being, despite the alienating effects of social distancing and all the other effects of the pandemic. So at the Arts Council, we believe that Ireland could show extraordinary vision and leadership at international level in adding cultural engagement as a core area in a new wellbeing framework, and there are discussions with that currently going on at the moment. It's an intensely exciting time for artists and for all who work in the arts in Ireland and for all who engage with the arts. We hope to harness the considerable energies currently at play, many of them present here in the room today, in order to build on this new reality, with the ambition of realising the most supportive environment possible. It's a time of real magical promise. And in doing this, I'm hopeful that we will arrive at a far better, a more inclusive and a far more complete understanding of cultural value.
Thanks, Maureen. And I couldn't help but notice that you began your job with impeccable timing just as the pandemic was getting going. So you have had to deal with COVID right from the get-go. So no doubt there'll be further questions there. And we're turning now to Robert Breed, who's been in post for a year now. So you're kind of mid-COVID, so to speak. Again, a possible point we'll return to, but Robert, over to you.
Thank you. I guess I'm here today because I've just had a very, very practical kind of personal experience of the profound impact that data utilization and research can have on an organisation, its impact, and the people that work in it. A few years in my last role, I was lucky enough to be appointed to be managing director of an independent arts organisation called King's Place. It was privately funded, well, to some degree, but it was mostly funded through self-revenue generation. So it did commercial events, conferencing during the day to support the artistic programme in the evening, and it had a very broad artistic remit. So it covered music of many different genres, but also included spoken word, comedy, like podcast recordings, a whole panoply of artistic activities. And it was an organisation that had nicely grown over the years. It started it was about 10 years old when I took it on. But it continued to do fairly well. But when I started, it was very much flatlining in terms of audience engagement and occupancy. And it really didn't take me long to realise that I couldn't just sustain the status quo. The status quo was not creating sufficient cultural impact, and that change was absolutely paramount. And Maureen, what you were just saying there about change just really, really resonated with me, because to be able to utilise, to maximise, enable change, I sort of finally realised that the only way I could do that in a very constructive and positive way was about data utilisation. It was something that was very new to that organisation. It hadn't really used it before, even though it was sitting on reams of it. And I think cultural organisations have are very privileged to have a vast amount of information that it gets in the box office, through its data systems, but it's sitting on these rich seams of phenomenal information. And I sort of had a kind of road to Damascus moment when I realised that we were just not in the habit of interrogating this accumulated vast amount of information, and how that could enable us to get an understanding of the truth, an understanding of the reality of where the organisation found itself in. And actually, I think one of the reasons that it hadn't confronted it, because it was scared about what the data would say. Because I think the organisation, I think many organisations, get very comfortable in fooling themselves that everything's fine. Let's not look too far under the bonnet, because we're slightly nervous about what we might see. In fact, someone recently said to me, in my new role, don't look there, because if the board find that information, they might be too heavy. But I think information can be scary, data can be scary. But I think it is so much about just sort of owning up to the responsibility of the truth. And I think once we started to look at that data, that information, and to really understand where we are, we couldn't possibly start to identify where we needed to change. And through doing that, I then found that it also had many other transformational benefits. So for the first time, I'm getting an understanding of who was coming, who was attending, who were we keeping happy. We could then see who wasn't coming, who's only coming once and then never coming again. All these really fundamental questions, and enabled us to build up a picture of what needed to change. Who do we need to prioritise of all the different audience segments? Who are we keeping happy? Who are we not keeping happy? Who's coming to us? Who's not coming to us? And that had a really sort of fundamental impact. For the first time, by looking at the data, we began to understand who we are. And that was something that, again, we hadn't really faced up to before. What is our position in the cultural landscape? What makes us distinctive? Because I think until then we kind of assumed, well, we want to be the kind of, you know, the best music venue in the UK, or the best music venue in you know, all these sort of things. And actually, when we got to look at the data, we realised that it was, we were getting a very high loyalty from people that were very close by. And actually, we began to realise that isn't it enough just to be the best possible cultural destination in that part of London? And I think once we got an understanding of that, we took a huge weight off our organisational shoulders. And we were able to really pinpoint and target those audiences that were in relatively easy reach of that destination. And so it enabled us to at last kind of prioritise our resources in very precise ways. And also to stop doing a lot of things. So we were able to kind of de-stress the organisation in a lot of ways that was throwing everything at everything. We were trying to program, you know, we had a dreadful fear of dark days, so we had something on every single night. And so actually when we decided we're going to prioritise this segment, that segment, in fact we had about 4 key areas that we decided that we were going to wholly focus on for the next couple of years. And that was absolutely a revelation. It took a lot of stress out of the organisation, but also it meant that we could marshal our forces more precisely. And it also gave us the opportunity to make this a cross-organisational responsibility. So not let it just be the responsibility of the marketing department or the programming department, because when we did this, it realised it has a fundamental impact not just to marketing, but also to what we're programming. And it meant that we were able to involve many people across the organisation. So many people, many more people had an investment in what we were doing, this new way of growing our audiences. And so it meant for a more cohesive, more unified team. And the result of this was that we started to see a steady improvement in occupancy rates. And of course, like anything that you start measuring and tracking, you can target improvement and you begin to see improvement, which you can then celebrate and acknowledge, and it makes people even more motivated to do better. And of course you can then extrapolate that to what you're doing about inclusivity and diversity, about sustainability. So again, that once we've started that process to start analysing, tracking, measuring, target setting, it had, you know, implications far beyond just growing our audiences. And of course, moving to Ireland, I found that this is now so deeply ingrained in me. This is something that I feel is very much my approach in the organisation I'm running now. But I don't have the advantage here of having the audience agency to help me with data and comparability. So it was very important for me to come along to this today, because I really want to be an evangelist and advocate for how we can build a coalition in cultural organisations in Ireland, so that we can come together to look at how we are pulling data together, how we're utilising our information, how can we get that analysis and intelligence about who's coming and who's not coming, and what can we be doing to increase engagement, particularly with those segments of the community who are underrepresented or don't feel that culture is for them.
Thank you very much, Robert. And you're leading something which has the word national in its title now, as opposed to King's Place,
Absolutely.
which was partly local, as you're describing, in its mission. So that takes us naturally to Lynn, who also has a national brief in the title of her organisation. So Lynn, over to you for your thoughts.
Thanks, Dan. The privilege and the pleasure of being last. So, always tricky. The question that was put to us was, how do you define cultural value in your institution? So, to start with, I wanted to tell a story. I've been in post now for 4 years. So I came into the National Museum of Ireland from Science Gallery Dublin, where I had been for a number of years, which wasn't a collecting organisation. So, different beast altogether. And when I came in, one of my first roles was to be introduced to all of the keepers of the collection. And so we have divisions. We have 4 museums, and each has a keeper. So we have a keeper of natural history, we have a keeper of Irish antiquities, a keeper of arts and industry, and a keeper of folklife. And so for somebody like me coming in to the organisation and hearing that term keeper, it sounded terribly archaic and exclusive, and holding this idea of keeper and holding this. And I bring the story up because I think it's important to think about, and we can play it all out a little bit, but at the moment we have an exhibition up the road in the museum. It's Columkill, it's Sacred Objects of a Saint, and it's his 1500th anniversary of his birthday. And within that exhibition we have the Shrine of the Cathach. And those of you who are, historians will know better than me and talk more about this, but the shrine was made in the 11th century, and its purpose was to contain a manuscript that was known as the Cathach or the Battler, and it was believed to have been written by Saint Columba. Those shrines are symbols of power and authority and sanctity, and they were used for tributes and curses and cures, and they were really important to society at that time. But what intrigued me was that the core of these relics, they were entrusted to hereditary tenants of church lands, to keepers, who passed them on from generation to generation to generation until ultimately it was taken into the Royal Irish Academy's collection in the 19th century and then came to the museum. And the reason I bring that story up is because when I first heard the term of keeper, my personal value associations immediately went to thinking of that as being something of withholding, keeping, not sharing. But actually the story of keeper, when you understand it, is something entirely different. It's about, to Maureen's point, it gives meaning to our experience of being alive. It's about this really important artifact of being carried through generations and generations, so that we can come to look at it afresh each time and in some ways mobilize it to see what it can tell us about our present, right? So I bring that up because I think that question about how do you find cultural value in your institution, and that story is really important. And I probably won't explain it clearly in the short time that we have, but I think what I wanted to get across is the National Museum of Ireland is interesting in the sense that it's a cultural institution, and as a cultural institution which has 4 sites and a collection space, it is heavy on resource, right? It's, it requires a lot to keep it going. But what is the value of that? Well, we talk a lot in our institution at the moment around relevance, okay? And so going back to that piece that I mentioned, so we have a role around the conserving and the protecting of the collection, but fundamentally that is intertwined with our role around ensuring accessibility and relevance and interpretation and engagement. And so that our collection should never be in isolation from the people that engage with it or view it. And our role is to mobilize it in ways that actually reflect the multiple identities that are in our community. So that we understand that what we have, it can be mobilized in a way to engage, to do what John was talking about and Stephen was talking about, to look at that piece around social cohesion. And I think that value piece, that value proposition about valuing the objects in the collection, but thinking of them in the consideration of how we demonstrate the relevance of that collection, is really important. Then the second piece I wanted to say was about being porous. So, and what do I mean by that? So, big institution again, and reading through, and Maureen mentioned it, the paper by the Arts and Humanities Research Centre, that piece around intrinsic value of the collection and its instrumental value, elite and popular, amateur and professional. And rather I think, and I know, Stephen, you cautioned against using the words ecology, but I think of our museum and our institution as being part of an ecosystem. And particularly when you talk about national cultural institutions, because they have heft and longevity to them. And in some ways, I think of them often as being anchors, that our purpose is to sustain the wider ecosystem around it, be that around the museum acquiring new work within our collection, be it around how we mobilize our institutions to provide space for events and concerts, be it around how we connect in with our local communities and open up the museum space. I think about my colleagues in IMA who did, Annie did such a wonderful job up in Kilmainham about opening up that space throughout COVID and it being a kind of incredibly porous space. And all of those elements, I think, are important in terms of our value, to society as a whole, right, in terms of what we do. So I feel we're a key niche and we need to think about that. And then I think, so the other piece about that then is all of those things are lovely, but those values have to be in some way linked to our impact, right? And the issue, and Robert touched on this, the issue is that traditionally we haven't, within these institutions, for a variety of reasons, been very good at collecting data about who's coming, why they're coming, more importantly, who's not coming, where's the gap. And we need to get better at that but I think the really interesting thing, and John, I think, always puts things really clearly for me. So I read papers and then I listen to John's talk and it made it much clearer. It's that piece about, and Robert and myself were talking about this, rather than collecting data to prove a point, collecting data to understand. And I think that's what we should be talking about today. We're not talking about collecting data to prove a point. What we're trying to do is we need to start collecting data to understand whether these kind of pieces that I mentioned around value are actually in some way existing for the visitors who come to our place. Who spend time with us, who give us their most precious commodity in the 21st century, which is time in many respects, right? So I think we need to start thinking that way. I think that it's really exciting to have this conversation today, and what I would love to see is something that starts to, rather than be knee-jerk, to take a long and deep look. And sometimes when my staff say to me, no, we need to slow down on this thing and make it a long and deep look, I go, no, just do it now. But I think in this case, it is about this we do actually need to look at a kind of baseline piece around this and to build that and to start to actually understand, and to see how that maps against our value. And then finally, one of the things that, Pat, when you were talking, and I hadn't, that I found interesting that I wrote down, and it came up a bit in Stephen's talk, and I haven't, Stephen, fully thought this out yet, but it's a little bit to do with what you were saying about that high arts and culture piece. And I was thinking that, and the class piece, so of the 4 divisions in the National Museum of Ireland, 3 of them are predominantly collected by professional amateurs. So in 3 of our museums, the things that we have on display are things that somebody who was walking up a mountain saw and dug up and gave to us, or somebody within the folk life collection had made themselves, like a beady, patch, chose to give to us, or was a natural historian, the early citizen scientist out to, and so there's something quite powerful in that, actually. And I think that links back to this idea that we've been discussing and this tension between this sort of cultural democracy piece as well. So this idea that in some way these things are either end of the spectrum and that's it, nothing exists in between. And I think for me, by nature, I'm always actually interested in the in-between, because I think that's where the really interesting stuff is. And so from the perspective of an institution like the museum, I actually think that one of the most difficult things that we could, the most damaging thing actually we could do is try and shoehorn an evaluation process into something incredibly complex, which everybody has brought up today. I thought, Emma, you made that point really well. And I actually think that what we need to do is understand and then try to build models that help us understand more. That help us look at the grey, that stop us from polarizing the sort of the amateur and the elite, the kind of, and actually, and it's a shame in some ways that Tanya isn't here today as well, because there is a lot of tension that exists even within the community, you know, the arts and culture community at the moment about programs that kind of prioritise participation over the artist, perhaps, you know, and Maureen, I know you'd be very familiar with that. So just unpacking that a little bit, I think, and not driving things into the extreme, but looking at that spectrum and understanding better. Thanks.
Thank you very much, and to all of our panelists. There's a great deal to think about there. I'm just going to stand up so I can see people. I was intrigued. I haven't really heard the word heritage mentioned today, which I find fascinating. People haven't felt the impulse to go towards heritage as a justifying term. And it's maybe something to think about amongst all the other different things that we could contemplate. Plenty of opportunity for questions, contributions, declarations, and so forth. Eve.
Thank you so much, it's probably a comment as much as a question, but rightly all the panellists have focused on participation, representation, usage, data of attendance and audiences and so on. But I wonder how we factor in, not as an alternative, but in addition, that vicarious value that comes from the fact that many, many people in this country will never go through the doors of the National Museum, the National Concert Hall, but they still want them to exist. They still want that sense that somebody is keeping the cultural life of the nation safe. So is that something that we need to add to the complexity of how we value culture? And this is not in that utilitarian sense of how it's being used, because it's much more distant. So it's just to throw that in. I know there are other questions coming.
Len and Robert, you want to have a go?
No, it's just, as you were saying that, I was just thinking what came up earlier on about sort of national pride. And I think there is a lot of people that will take pride in these large national cultural organisations being sustained and thriving in a post-pandemic period. And I think it does reflect well on the nation. I think it is something that individuals do take a lot of pride in. So it's kind of good to know that they're there.
It's interesting, Eve, on that point in terms of relevance, but when Project 2040 was announced and there was major capital funding for the first time into all of our national cultural institutions, I know that there was some concern and preparation for if there was pushback in terms of why are we spending this amount of money on our cultural institutions, because it was, you know, in total it was a significant amount. Not enough, but it's significant. But there wasn't at all. Nobody said, why isn't this being spent on health or education or policing, or it was universally applauded and acknowledged and moved on. So I think there's something, you know, there is something in that. But I think your point is a really important one, but it shouldn't be a reason not to do the others. Does that make sense?
Absolutely.
And that would be my worry, is that, not my worry, I think that perhaps sometimes that happened in the past, that role in of itself was enough. And actually, I think we have to, as institutions, demonstrate our relevance to the people that we are there to serve. Yeah.
Yeah, if I could add to that, you know, what the economists call existence and bequest value, they're important values, but they're never sufficient values. And this, I mean, I'm going to be hammering this drum all along here, that we really cannot ignore the determinant of all values, really, in the current situation. Actually, I want to add to this my definition of cultural policy. It's the politics of how we contest and allocate resources to culture. And the politics is important because I think, you know, I've raised a political point here tonight about economic inequality in society, but this is becoming existential. Just think of the impact in Britain of Brexit and what it did to the 40-year-old agenda for multiculturalism and cultural inclusion in England. It shattered it completely, and all on the basis that there was a forgotten class of people who got angry and developed these very negative politics, which have profound cultural effects. So we can't really talk about cultural value without processing this. And I think all of our democracies, even this one here, are subject to these pressures at the moment, an increasing drift to the right of the spectrum, and a denial of the very kind of forms of diversity that we all champion.
Powerful point, I think, Maureen. I
Yes.
expect you have a thought
Yeah.
on this as well.
I think that's an excellent point, and I love Lynn's use of the word course. I think I've heard you use that before in another similar type event, and it's my favourite word from the pandemic, because now we absolutely have this opportunity. Society is more porous. There are opportunities, so to your point, Eve, like if you think that somebody living in Carlow could access the National Symphony Orchestra, or that they knew they could access it online, that's a very powerful thing, and that means that we're in a far, far better place.
John, please, yeah.
Just taking up Pat's existence point, which is a very strong argument. If you don't mind me asking, what proportion of the National Museum's collection would never go on display? I say that because I have heard things from my grandfather that I put away. I never visit them, and I would never throw them away. So I'm not suggesting if there's a very high proportion that's never on display, there's still a very strong argument for retaining them.
Yeah, no, it's so. I mean, about 95% of the collection is not on display currently, as of this moment right now. Yeah, but that doesn't mean it's not accessible. Important point. Because it is accessible. Not as accessible as I'd like it to be, though, John, if I'm perfectly honest. Yeah. So I think, in terms of what is in our museums, there's an acknowledgement, I think, amongst us all that we are in the museum. And when I say we all, I mean my colleagues across the museum sites. Is that we are kind of stuck with, at the moment, with permanent exhibitions that need to be moved and changed, and they aren't really reflective in the most part. And we have an interesting challenge afoot at the moment where we have been funded to develop a new exhibition, 20th Century History of Ireland, which is wonderful and absolutely terrifying at the same time, if I'm perfectly honest. For a lot of reasons, I can see people nodding their heads because they know exactly. And if even just to give you an indication, at the moment we're like in a place where we're talking about, well, how do we, at the start of this exhibition, introduce the problematic nature of terms like nation and state before we even go into this, right? So sorry, that's just to get to the point that within that exhibition, that is giving us an opportunity to bring in a lot of material that's been contemporary collected over the last 120 years. So whether it's elements from Magdalen laundries, or whether it's elements through kind of design, Kilkenny design, which is contracting kind of dark and light there in some respects. But I think that piece around how do you access it is a crucial thing. So that's something that we are looking at in terms of the ongoing collections resource centre and how that becomes accessible. But what I would say is it's really interesting whenever somebody decides to come to the museum for whatever reason, as a personal visit, or we're always able to pull out something from the collection that was dug out of the ground of their home place, and that's quite powerful. It's really powerful, and I think we just need to do a much better job of actually having that out, so that people, either through a digitised form or through collections, a good collections resource centre.
Yeah, you mentioned the digital dimension there, which is obviously, but expensive and requires its own curation and resources and hosting and all those other issues, which are
That is
a
the problem.
challenge.
It's all expensive. That is the problem.
Reba, I think you had a question there.
Yeah, thanks very much for fantastic contributions. And I was going to bring up something that you mentioned at the start, which was about heritage. And I was talking to Martin about this earlier, and where does heritage fit into culture, and this maybe uneasy umbrella term, and how can we deal with that? And thinking of what Stephen was saying as well in terms of the value of art or of artists in Ireland, I would argue goes beyond the foundation of the state, going right back to things like Columcille and the rich heritage that we have, and I think we do value it. So I don't know whether do the panel think that we need, I would say urgently, to have a definition of what culture means and what culture includes, so that everything actually gets proper due attention. Is that something that's worth doing?
Well, it's interesting because heritage is currently outside of our department.
I think the biggest challenge with that question.
No,
but it's the tendency, and I think again Stephen referred to it. when this, I used to do this graphic for the artists, for, the phrase arts and culture. Well, I would make, arts like 86 point, and I'd make culture like 10 point. Because really, when we talk about arts and culture, they drift towards making arts a metonymy for all of culture. Because everybody finds it so difficult to think about culture in any complex form. And this is important with civil servants actually. They love to simplify it into the arts thing. Because then it's something they can manage, and it's something they feel it's contained, right? But in actual fact, the work around culture is incredibly difficult, because you have to try and you have to have multi-dimensional understandings of what's going on at any one time. And I would sometimes think, there might be some virtue, and this might sound sacrilegious, in merging a heritage council with an arts council, so that you've got a cross-disciplinary understanding. Because I worked in the heritage sector effectively for 30 years, and I can tell you one of the motivating things about that was that, I had much greater access through heritage to that other part of society than I would have through the arts. Let's face it, the arts are largely a middle-class domain of activity, and the guilt complex of that, of course, manifests itself, and of course we have to do outreach, we have to go into working-class communities. Nobody wants to go into middle-class communities for some reason, even though some enlightenment there might
They're
serve
very
some
unsafe.
purpose. You don't go near them, they're already taken care of. But I think there's a lot, in fact, I learned through bringing art into heritage sites that there was this brilliant thing where, say, working class people would come to the park I used to manage, and they'd say, what is that? And they'd be suddenly encountering, serendipitously, a piece of sculpture. I just thought that was so brilliant. And, that it wasn't, I am going to a gallery today. Because if you say that to yourself, you almost mark yourself off as bourgeois, as opposed to, there's these kind of self-determining sociological processes we all go through. So the dialogue between the heritage field and the arts field, I think, has a huge amount. The Heritage Council has been very good at tapping into the voluntary energies of society.
Yeah.
And the Arts Council, I have to say, has lost sight. That's one of the tragedies of the history that I've just, recounted. Before 1973, great at enabling amateur musical societies, theatrical societies. They lost that, and they became about professional mediation. That's not sufficient.
And there is obviously a role for Creative Ireland has developed as well, but I don't know if you want to comment on that,
Yeah,
Maureen.
just on this particular topic, we now run Culture Night, as people might know, and it's very interesting. The research that we have done around Culture Night, which Robert and Lynn have been very involved in too, is it's supporting that idea of not having that chasm, because Culture Night is seen as very democratic, very porous, very appealing, a joyous celebration. And that's because it doesn't have that terrifying arts tag across it, so, yeah.
I think it's very important to remember there's a lot of expenditure at local government level that's taking up some of the slack you were mentioning.
Yeah.
The local government expenditure is higher than the Arts Council.
Yeah.
So you have to take it in the whole.
And the role of heritage officers. And it's quite interesting, at that point that I was sort of bringing up about the museum and the heritage. So, there's Heritage Ireland 2030, which was just launched, and actually I think myself and Pat were on the same call just talking about it, and I think it has one line in museums about it within Heritage Ireland 2030. There's a lot to fit in, so that's okay. But I suppose that interplay between those two, and I think we're here today maybe in some ways to talk about audience, and to just maybe bring it back to audience again, and the question of audience. There is something about crossing the threshold, right? That perhaps, Pat, to your point and to others, people's experiences of heritage have a less definitive threshold to cross.
I think we should talk about citizenship before we talk about audiences.
Yeah.
And if we talked about citizenship more, we would have a better ethics on these matters. Because, again, some of the Arts Council's policies on arts and education, they empower a tiny group of artists to go into a highly select number of schools. When it's really, as citizens, what people need are processes that work universally for all, especially primary school children. We must have that as a goal, that art is in the classroom for all students. And we can't just have special experiences of one artist going into that primary school there and maybe 5 or 6 more, and then the job is done. We've got to stop doing that. We have to work on universalist approaches to access to the humanities and the arts within the educational system.
And Creative Schools is very much
Yes.
built on that universal principle, you know.
I think, Grania, I think you had a question, yeah.
I think we touched on some like really tricky words there, so I want to sort of maybe introduce another one if that's the one. You all mentioned the word engagement, either with arts and culture generally or with your own institutions and organisations specifically, and that this was sort of at the forefront, you know, of developing, you know, I guess the realm of arts and culture and our engagement with it. And what I want to ask you is, do you have any strategies in mind of how you will measure the quality of those engagements, or how will you differentiate different types of engagement?
I'll direct that to Robert. If you put you on the spot there.
It does. I mean, engagement is a fairly tricky one, but I think I think in recent times engagement has really been more trackable, more measurable, certainly through social media and in digital activities. And I think certainly in the past couple of years where that has really been come to the fore, and it's so important to all our organisations, that's where we've really seen the priority on engagement, to see, you know, what are we getting back from the contact that we have with people? Is what we're doing meaningful? Is it having impact? It is sometimes very, very difficult to measure, but it certainly has become much more of a great priority in the past 2 years. And it's something that we just need to continue to do. And I think this, you know, it relates to that whole kind of post-pandemic paradigm shift. And that Maureen, you mentioned it about this, the responsibility we have, that we cannot, you know, continue the status quo, is that we have to now, we're rebuilding our you know, cultural infrastructure, we're rebuilding our audiences, and making sure that engagement is wholly, squarely, you know, focused on accessibility, diversity, and inclusion is absolutely paramount. And then engagement has a really, really critical part to play in that.
A question, if I could, just to ask about what might be a possible tension between social cohesion on the one hand, which has been mentioned a number of times as a kind of value, as a motive, if you like, and a reason for supporting the arts and valuing them, and the critical function of the arts, which is presumably not necessarily predicated on social cohesion, but which is challenging and questioning and potentially undermining certain orthodoxies and ideologies embedded in the society. So, I mean, is that, I don't know, Pat, whether you have any thoughts on this. It might be something that you've considered. I'm just wondering whether that is a genuine tension, or whether we need to speak to the critical function of the arts a little bit more explicitly.
Yeah, I think sometimes we assume the critical relationship between the arts and the general functions of society, and it can allow for complacency. Now, in this book, I talk about the arts in the Celtic Tiger period, and it's a fact that over about 30 years in this country, Charles Haughey was a very dominant character in the arts field, and very many of our leading artists became highly enamoured of Haughey, and their greatest praise was that he did great things for the arts. Well, you know, that's a self-enclosing group right there. But, you know, one of the tough questions to ask about the collapse that happened in 2008 was, where had the artists been? Where had been the critical voices speaking truth to power all through that? And in truth, they were very hard to find. Now, they began to emerge, I think, more strongly after that point. So that that chap, what's his name, Gough, is it? He said the duty of the artist now is to get kicked out of the country for saying obnoxious things to people in power. But, you know, I would find it hard to find an artist who came even remotely close to getting kicked out of this country for speaking truth to power between 1980 and 2010. And of course, all this time they're all saying, oh, the Arts Council, it's all about, you know, arm's length distance so that the freedom of the artist can be protected, right? It was a myth in itself, I won't go into that. But the question then is, what were you doing with the freedom? You know, where was the critique? Where was the social critique? Why weren't, I mean, just one artist, I think it was, brought out a play, Sebastian Barry, in about 2007, that had an allegorical critique of Haughey in it. And people closed around it and said, this is vicious stuff, and there was a very bad reception of it and all the rest of it. And he would not have been my idea of a radical artist to begin with. So there is this kind of tension between the artist. I mean, Sean O'Faolain, who was an absolutely dyed-in-the-wool libertarian, said, the artist has to suffer exclusion, and that would be economic exclusion, in order that they can be a critical voice to politics. And that's what he was. I mean, he started the Bell magazine in the 40s. He wrote an adulatory biography of De Valera in 1938, and he turned around and wrote another one, which was hugely critical of him in 1943, with the result that he never got another penny from De Valera's government. But that was the price he was willing to pay. Do you know? So there is a big debate around liberal values in the old-fashioned sense, and what we might call the kind of welfarist values that now seem to include the artists within governance system, to the extent that they are themselves governed by them.
And Maureen, how do you navigate that as a funder? I imagine that must be a certain pressure, or do you feel it particularly acutely in making decisions about funding and so on?
I don't feel it. I mean, I suppose the world has changed so much since that time, and because like artists have obviously been very involved in marriage equality and repeal and so on. There's a certain all facing the same direction now, I think, a bit, and more recently Ukraine and post-pandemic. I think it makes it easier for it relieves that tension hugely, I would think. And I guess, back to the poorest thing, government, the state, we might all more or less agree, behaved quite well during the pandemic, I think, and is far more porous. It's far more available to us now, and I don't think there's any going back, at the risk of sounding like Pollyanna. So, yeah.
Interesting.
There's an interesting, on that as well, around, Lonnie Bunch, who was, very much in the development of the Museum of African American Culture and History in the US, and he talks a lot about, the legitimization of experience in terms of the roles of museums and so on. I think that's interesting as well in the context of this conversation to a certain extent, particularly when you're talking about, the sort of national cultural institutions piece. And that legitimization, I mean, we could probably spend some time just talking about that, but one of the things that interested, on a personal experience, we did an exhibition in the museum around Magdalene Laundries. It was work by an artist, a glass artist based in the north, Alison Lowry, and it was a very powerful exhibition in terms of, and certainly the feedback that we got from visitors. But one of the things that came back, it was around, was the people who had been in a Magdalene Laundry or in, very much were saying, I feel that this legitimizes my experience because it's in a cultural institution. So I just bring that up by way of kind of talking about that. It's another element of that. Continuation, maybe, perhaps is a better way of putting it.
I think that's a very important point, and I think there's a kind of almost a politics of recognition, and that the arts as forms of recognition that they give. They validate certain kinds of experience and acknowledge them. So that can be part of the kind of social mission, and I think the justification and value of the arts. Do we have any other questions? We're kind of getting close to time. Yes.
There's somebody else.
There's somebody just behind. So yes, please. Yeah.
I have a question in relation to the relevance, because there was a mention earlier of King's Place, and we have a King's Place in Dublin as well, please.
In your spare time, you can just
in
work one
relation
up.
to the National Concert Hall and the programme being relevant to people, or the programme of whether there's an education programme or a collection. And because we were talking about data, I'm really interested in seeing who is in the room, who is not, and I find it very, very difficult myself. How would you measure whether something is not attended, or whether something, can you tell whether something you're doing is irrelevant versus something that is, it can be irrelevant to certain people, or whether people are not interested because they're purely interested in something else. So how would you measure who's not in the room, why they're not in the room, and maybe
Oh, sure. I mean, in the UK, I was able to do that because of the information that I could get from the audience agency that aggregates data and information from a very, very wide and broad number of cultural organisations. So I had comparability. So I could look at comparing someone like King's Place to the Barbican or to the Wigmore Hall or the South Bank Centre. So it enabled me to do that kind of profiling. Is that where am I doing well in terms of comparability, where I'm not doing so well. So I mean, so it was you know, it wasn't a perfect science by any means, but having that that broad comparability was very, very helpful. And of course, it wasn't just looking at music venues; it was also looking at non-music venues in the cultural sector. So there was a way of looking at it from a sort of macro and micro level. But that's where I got that insight into who am I engaging with, who am I not engaging with, who's coming, who's not coming.
And yeah, I suppose because sometimes what's missing is how do I get information from people who are not coming if they're not coming?
Yeah, absolutely.
So that's quite difficult.
I mean, that is difficult, and you also had to do. I mean, I also sort of undertook our own surveys and polls and focus groups and things like that. And focus groups were a good way of being able to recruit people who we knew never came. So we were able to sort of ask them directly, why aren't you coming? What would you come to see if we had it on? You know. So there are other ways that we did kind of try and delve deeper into answering those kind of questions.
Thanks. Question at the back, yeah.
Yeah, it's more of a remark than a question. As an artist who's trying to make a living from art, I find it a terrible cliche to think or to suggest that an artist has to suffer to make good work. I find that really, I've heard that's an old idea for me. It's completely irrelevant if I to think about that. It's really irrelevant.
And do you find, I mean, in what context does it come up that like people are, just generally people offer that to you?
You know, people have this concept that you have to suffer to be good art, and I don't believe that for a moment. I think it's ridiculous.
Can I come back on that since I raised the issue?
The qualification.
Yeah, first of all, I'd like to point out that I was actually quoting Sean O'Faolain when I said that, and that those were the values that he lived and was prepared to live by all of his life. And I think that's pretty admirable in itself. But I do think there is a genuine choice for any artist who wants to be socially engaged, or even more so politically engaged. They do have a choice that they may make themselves unpopular. And the question then becomes for them at an ethical level, how far are you prepared to take that? And the other aspect of this as well, of course, I'd like to, there's this assumption that we've all gone into this idea of thinking of artists as professionals. So sometimes I meet people and they say, I'm a professional artist, which means that I might get a grant from the Arts Council for 3,000 this time, whatever time, or whatever. But the best example I can think of this is there was a theatre group that put on a play in Leitrim in 2004, and there were 2 performers, and there were 2 people in the audience, and the total takings on the night was 28 euros, half of which had to go to the venue, so they got 14 euros.
I think I did that gig.
But the point I want to get around to here is, they thought of themselves and perceived themselves as professionals, but in actual real terms they were amateurs. They were doing it for the love of it. Because this is one of the base words in modern discourse, by the way. Amateur is, I've done a TED talk on this. Amateur is equivalent to messer, or somebody who doesn't take anything seriously. How did we get to a point where the word with the Latin root of which is the word for love, amo, now means messer, and somebody who's just a dilettante? We really need to investigate that.
Doesn't mean that.
But the point is that artists can be much more than besides artists. After all, T.S. Eliot was a publisher. Wallace Stevens, I think, was an insurance.
Yeah.
Well, you know, there's no reason why we cannot mix. I mean, Roddy Doyle got most of his inspiration for his early books by being a school teacher. What's ignoble about that?
John, we'll come back to John. And,
Yeah, sorry, Eurobarometer is a very good source of data. Just a question here. There's a huge section on why people don't attend.
Yeah.
So it's extremely good. I just want to come back to the innovation experimentation, and that's also critiquing society. Robert, if I can ask you, what do you see the role of the National Concert Hall in experimentation, allowing new composers to perform, even if the hall is empty?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I have this conversation nearly every day, and the tension between us having a full hall and the tension between, particularly in the post-COVID environment, about having a popular, genuinely popular and accessible program, because there's the need to get people back and the need to get people out of the habit, you know, of watching Netflix at home and actually get them back into our cultural organisations. But I feel very, very strongly is the responsibility, though, that this is a once-in-a-generation moment when we actually truly have to deliver on what we've been promising for a long time but never truly delivered. And that's to ensure that we are being, you know, meaningfully inclusive and diverse and accessible. And that means that it has to be a venue, a destination, which is open to experimentation, innovation, supporting young and emerging artists and music makers, and we have to be confident in that some things might fail spectacularly, and we have to be, and I want that to be the kind of organisation that we are, that we can experiment, we can have the confidence for things to not be successful in terms of occupancy and revenue, and it's my kind of mission to ensure that we're not just rating our success by how full the hall is. And it has to be based on other measurements and matrices. But that's something I'm sort of grappling with every day.
a good point of inspiration on which to end, I think. But we're not entirely ending, because there's the reception up the road at the Royal Irish Academy, and Shelley Dean at the back is going to lead anyone who might be fearful that they couldn't find their way up Dawson Street just before. If you've gone past the Lord Mayor's residence, well, you know, you've gone too far. So